The winter of 1887 hit Cedar Falls, Montana like a punishment from God himself. Snow piled 8 feet high against the orphanage windows, and inside, the coal had run out 3 days ago. 17 children huddled under threadbare blankets, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. But it wasn't the cold that would change everything. It was what happened when the authorities finally came calling. 6 pairs of eyes watched from the corner as men in dark coats shuffled through papers and pointed at different children. The Hartwell siblings, ranging from 4-year-old Lucy to 16-year-old Marcus, had learned long ago that when adults whispered and pointed, children got separated forever. "We have no parents, just each other," Marcus had told his brothers and sisters that morning, gathering them close. "Whatever happens, we stay together." He had no idea how impossible that promise would be to keep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other at Cedar Falls Municipal Orphanage, gray, cold, and full of hunger. Marcus Hartwell stood at the frost-covered window, watching the town below come alive with chimney smoke and the distant sound of horses on cobblestone. Behind him, his 5 siblings stirred awake on the thin mattresses they shared in the corner of the dormitory. Emma, 13 years old, with auburn hair that caught what little light crept through the windows, already had 4-year-old Lucy on her hip. The little girl's thumb was permanently fixed in her mouth, her wide blue eyes taking in everything but saying nothing. She hadn't spoken a word since their parents died in the fire 2 years ago. 10-year-old twins. Daniel and David sat cross-legged on their shared blanket, Daniel carefully mending a hole in David's only shirt with thread Emma had pulled from her own sleeve. The boys were identical in looks but opposite in nature, Daniel quiet and thoughtful, David quick to laugh despite their circumstances. 8-year-old Sarah sat nearby, her dark hair braided with a piece of string, teaching herself letters by tracing them in the dust on the floor. She was the dreamer of the group, always talking about the house they'd live in someday, with windows that weren't cracked and a kitchen that smelled like fresh bread. Marcus, the eldest at 16, felt the weight of responsibility for all of them pressing down on his shoulders like the Montana snow pressed against the orphanage roof. He'd been more father than brother since the fire took their parents, and he wore that burden in the set of his jaw and the wariness in his dark eyes. The orphanage housed 17 children total, but the Hartwells kept to themselves. They'd learned that getting too close to other children meant watching them disappear one day without warning, adopted by families who only wanted one child, or sent to work farms where letters home were rare and visits never came. Matron Caldwell appeared in the doorway, her black dress rustling like crow's wings. She was a thin woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch, her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. Her eyes swept the room and landed on the Hartwell corner with particular intensity. "Breakfast," she announced, though everyone knew there would barely be enough watery porridge to fill a grown man's palm, let alone feed 17 hungry children. Hartwells filed into the dining hall with the others, Lucy still clinging to Emma's hip, the twins walking so close their shoulders touched, Sarah holding Marcus's hand. They'd learned to move as a unit, to never let too much space come between them. The porridge was thinner than usual, and Marcus watched his siblings push the meager portions around their bowls. He quietly divided his own serving among them, telling them he wasn't hungry when Lucy's stomach growled loud enough for half the table to hear. After breakfast, while the other children attended lessons with Miss Patterson, a kind woman who tried her best with no books and fewer supplies, Marcus noticed Matron Caldwell speaking with 2 men in heavy coats near the front door. One carried a leather satchel, the other a clipboard thick with papers, county officials. Marcus's blood ran cold. He'd heard whispers from the older children about what happened when county men came. Families rarely adopted children in groups, especially not 6 of them. The officials came to break up sibling sets, to send children to different homes across the territory where they'd never see each other again. Marcus found Emma in the sewing room, trying to let out the hem of Sarah's dress for the third time. The fabric was so worn it was more whole than cloth, but Emma worked with the concentration of a seamstress, creating a ball gown. "Emma," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard, "we need to talk. All of us." 20 minutes later, the 6 Hartwell children huddled in the storage room beneath the stairs, surrounded by broken furniture and moth-eaten linens. It was the only place in the orphanage where they could speak without being heard. "County men are here," Marcus said without preamble. "I saw Matron Caldwell with them. They had papers." Emma's face went pale. She shifted Lucy to her other hip, and the little girl seemed to sense the tension, pressing her face against Emma's shoulder. "They can't separate us," Emma whispered. "We promised Mama and Papa we'd stay together." Daniel, always the practical one among the twins, spoke up. "How can we stop them? We're just children." "We're not just children," Marcus said firmly. "We're family. And families protect each other." David, usually quick with a joke, was uncharacteristically serious. "What do you want us to do, Marcus?" Before Marcus could answer, the storage room door creaked open. Matron Caldwell's sharp face appeared, flanked by the 2 county officials. Behind them stood several of the other orphans, their faces pressed together, trying to see what was happening. "There you are," Matron Caldwell said, her voice carrying the false sweetness she used when important visitors were present. "These gentlemen need to speak with you children." The taller official, a man with a gray beard and kind eyes that didn't match the grim set of his mouth, stepped forward. "I'm Mr. Patterson from the Montana Territory Child Welfare Office. This is Mr. Hayes from the county clerk's office." Marcus stood, positioning himself in front of his siblings. "What do you want with us?" Mr. Patterson consulted his clipboard. "We have good news. Several families in the territory have expressed interest in providing homes for you children." "All of us?" Emma asked, hope creeping into her voice despite herself. The officials exchanged a look that made Marcus's stomach drop. "Well," Mr. Hayes said, clearing his throat, "the Mitchell family in Bozeman is prepared to take the 2 oldest boys. That would be you, Marcus, and one of the twins. The Thornton family in Great Falls specifically requested a young girl," Mr. Patterson added, looking at Emma. "They have a daughter about your age and think you'd be wonderful companions." "What about the rest of us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Henderson family in Billings is excited to welcome the remaining twin and the younger girl," Mr. Hayes said, consulting his papers. "And little Lucy here has caught the attention of a very nice couple in Missoula who've been hoping for a daughter just her age." Silence filled the small storage room. The other orphans in the doorway seemed to sense the gravity of what was happening. They'd all lived with the fear of separation, but watching it happen to someone else was somehow worse than imagining it happening to yourself. "No," Marcus said quietly. Mr. Patterson blinked. "I beg your pardon? I said no." Marcus's voice grew stronger. "We stay together, all of us." Matron Caldwell's false sweetness evaporated. "Marcus, you will not speak to these gentlemen in that tone. They're offering you children opportunities most orphans can only dream of: real homes, real families." "We already have a real family," Emma said, stepping up beside Marcus. "We have each other." Mr. Hayes looked genuinely sympathetic, but his voice remained firm. "I understand this is difficult, but you must think practically. What are the chances of finding one family willing and able to take 6 children? It's simply not realistic. These families have been carefully selected," Mr. Patterson added. "They have good homes, stable incomes, and they specifically want children. You'd all have opportunities for education, proper meals, warm clothes, together." Daniel interrupted, speaking for the first time. "We want those things together," David nodded emphatically. We promised our parents we'd stay together. We promised each other. Sarah, tears streaming down her cheeks, clung to Marcus's arm. Please don't make us go to different places, please. Lucy, who hadn't spoken in 2 years, suddenly pulled her thumb from her mouth and looked directly at Mr. Patterson. In a voice so small it was barely audible, she whispered, "No separate." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Even Matron Caldwell's expression softened slightly. Everyone knew Lucy hadn't spoken since her parents died, but the officials had heard pleas like this before, and their resolve didn't waver. "Children," Mr. Hayes said gently, "sometimes growing up means making difficult choices. These families are prepared to welcome you immediately. The arrangements have already been made. Tomorrow morning, you'll be traveling to your new homes." "Tomorrow?" Emma's voice cracked. "The Mitchell family is sending their wagon for Marcus and Daniel first thing in the morning," Mr. Patterson confirmed. "The Thorntons will arrive around noon for Emma. The Hendersons will collect David and Sarah in the afternoon, and the couple from Missoula will pick up Lucy on Thursday." Marcus felt the world tilting beneath his feet. Everything was happening too fast, too final. "You can't do this. We won't go." Matron Caldwell's patience finally snapped. "You most certainly will go, Marcus Hartwell. These good people are offering you homes out of the kindness of their hearts. You should be grateful, not difficult. Grateful?" Marcus's voice rose despite himself. "Grateful to have my family torn apart? Grateful to never see my brothers and sisters again?" "You're being dramatic," Matron Caldwell snapped. "These families live in Montana territory. It's not as if you're being sent to different countries." "Might as well be," Emma said quietly. "Bozeman to Missoula might as well be the moon when you're children with no money and no way to travel." Mr. Patterson consulted his pocket watch. "We need to finalize the paperwork, Mrs. Caldwell. If you could gather their belongings." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We don't have belongings," Sarah said bitterly. "We have the clothes on our backs and each other. And tomorrow we won't even have that." The officials began moving toward the door, clearly considering the matter settled. The other orphans scattered, not wanting to be caught lingering when the authorities were conducting business. "Wait," Marcus called out, desperation creeping into his voice. "What if we ran away? What if we just left?" Mr. Hayes turned back, his expression stern. "That would be very unwise, son. Runaway orphans are brought back by the sheriff, and the consequences are severe. Besides, where would you go? 6 children alone in a Montana winter. You wouldn't survive a week." As the officials left to complete their paperwork, the Hartwell siblings remained huddled in the storage room. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of tomorrow's inevitable separations. Finally, Emma spoke. "Maybe they're right. Maybe this is our only chance for real homes." "They're not our homes if we're not together," Marcus said fiercely. "A home is where your family is, but what choice do we have?" Daniel asked practically. "They're not asking us. They're telling us." David, usually the optimist, stared at the floor. "At least we'll know where each other are. Maybe when we're grown up, we can find each other again." Sarah started crying again. "I don't want to wait until we're grown up. I want to stay with you now." Lucy crawled into Marcus's lap and wrapped her small arms around his neck. She didn't say anything else, but her grip was tight, as if she could prevent tomorrow from coming through sheer will. That evening, the Hartwells barely touched their meager dinner. While the other children played quiet games or worked on their lessons, the 6 siblings sat together on Marcus's narrow bed, trying to memorize each other's faces. Emma braided Sarah's hair one last time, weaving in a piece of blue thread she'd been saving for something special. Daniel taught David a new knot he'd learned from one of the older boys, their heads bent together in concentration. Marcus held Lucy while Sarah, Told them all a story about a magical place where families never had to say goodbye. As the oil lamps were dimmed and the orphanage settled into its nightly quiet, the Hartwell children lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring wagons and new families and empty spaces where their brothers and sisters used to be. "I love you all," Marcus whispered into the darkness. 5 voices whispered back, "We love you too." None of them knew that 50 miles away, a lonely cattleman named Thomas Brennan was staring out his own window, thinking about the empty rooms in his house and wondering if 6 children, who refused to be separated, might be exactly what his broken heart needed to heal, but that discovery was still hours away. And for now, the Hartwell siblings held each other close and tried to make their last night together last forever. Thomas Brennan woke before dawn, same as he had every morning for the past 3 years. The silence in his ranch house was so complete. It felt like a living thing pressing against his ears. He dressed in the dark worn denim, flannel shirt soft from washing, boots that had walked these floors when they'd held the sound of children's laughter. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee from the night before. Thomas lit the stove and set the kettle to boil, then stood at the window watching the eastern horizon blush pink. His property stretched for miles in every direction, rolling pastures where his cattle grazed, a creek that never ran dry, mountains that caught the morning light like purple glass. It was beautiful land, prosperous land, land meant for a family, but Thomas lived alone now, and the emptiness of the house followed him from room to room like a faithful dog. He was 42 years old, though the Montana sun and wind had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older. His hair was still thick and dark, streaked with premature silver at the temples. He was tall and broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or mend a broken fence post with equal skill. 3 years ago, this house was full of life. His wife Margaret had filled it with music. She played piano every evening after supper, and their twin boys, James and Joseph, would dance around the parlor until she laughed and told them to settle down. The boys had been 8 years old then, full of questions about everything from why grass grew green to whether the stars had names. The influenza had taken all 3 of them within a week. Thomas poured his coffee and walked to the parlor, where Margaret's piano sat silent under a dustcloth. He'd covered it the day after the funeral and hadn't uncovered it since. Sometimes, late at night, he thought he could hear phantom melodies drifting through the house, but it was only the wind. Through the eaves, he'd tried to sell the ranch twice. Both times, he'd made it as far as the bank in Cedar Falls before turning around and riding home. This land held too many memories to abandon, but it also held too much emptiness to bear alone. After breakfast, Thomas saddled his horse Ranger and rode out to check the cattle. The herd was thriving, over 300 head of prime beef cattle that grazed on some of the finest pasture in Montana Territory. His foreman, Jim Carleo, managed the day-to-day operations with a crew of 6 cowboys, leaving Thomas free to handle the business side of things. But today, as he rode through the peaceful morning, Thomas couldn't shake the restlessness that had been growing in him for weeks. The ranch ran itself, his bank account was comfortable, and he had no debts to speak of. By any measure, he was a successful man. He was also slowly dying of loneliness. When he returned to the house around noon, Jim was waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee and a troubled expression. "Problem?" Thomas asked, dismounting and looping Ranger's reins around the hitching post. "Got some news from town," Jim said. He was a weathered man in his 50s who'd worked for Thomas for over a decade. "Might not be my place to mention it, but I thought you should know." Thomas settled into the chair beside him. "What kind of news?" "County officials were at the orphanage yesterday. Word is they're splitting up that family of kids, the Hartwells. 6 of them, been together since their folks died in that fire a couple of years back." Thomas knew about the Hartwell children, though he'd never met them. The whole territory had heard about the fire that killed their parents, A terrible accident that left 6 children with no relatives willing or able to take them in. The children had been at the Cedar Falls orphanage ever since. Splitting them up how? Thomas asked. Different families all over the territory. Oldest boy and one of the twins are going to Bozeman this morning. The girl is going to Great Falls. Rest of them scattered to Billings and Missoula. Jim shook his head. Shame. To break up a family like that. Thomas stared out at his empty pastures. Why are they being separated? Same reason they always are. Nobody wants 6 kids at once. Too expensive, too much work. Easier to find homes for them 1 or 2 at a time. But they want to stay together? From what I heard, they fought it hard. Oldest boy Marcus, I think his name, has tried to convince the officials to let them be. Even got the little one to speak, and she ain't said a word since her parents died. But the county don't care about what children want. They care about what's practical. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The morning wind rustled through the cottonwood trees Margaret had planted when they were first married. She dreamed of children playing under those trees someday, of a house full of voices and laughter. How old are they? He asked. Oldest is 16, youngest is 4. Got 2 sets of twins and the middle boy's about 10. And then there's a girl around 8 and another around 13. 6 children. 6 children who were being torn apart today because no one believed a family could stay together when they had nothing but each other. You thinking what I think you're thinking? Jim asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer immediately. The idea forming in his mind was either the most generous thing he'd ever considered or the most foolish. Probably both. How long since the first wagon left for Bozeman? Jim consulted his pocket watch. Hour ago, maybe 2. But Thomas, you can't be seriously considering. I have 6 empty bedrooms, Jim. I have more money than I know what to do with. I have land that could support 100 children if I had to. You also have a business to run and no experience raising children that aren't your own, Jim pointed out. 6 kids who've been through more trauma than most adults. That's not the same as having your own boys back. Thomas stood up abruptly. Saddle a fresh horse, Jim. I'm riding to town. Thomas, wait. Think about this. You can't just ride into Cedar Falls and demand they give you 6 children. That's not how adoption works. Then how does it work? Jim ran a hand through his graying hair. I don't know. But I know it involves paperwork and background checks and all sorts of official business. You can't just show up and watch me, Thomas said, already striding toward the barn. The ride to Cedar Falls took 45 minutes at a hard gallop. Thomas's mind raced faster than his horse's hooves. He had no plan beyond arriving at the orphanage and somehow convincing the authorities that 6 children belonged together, preferably with him. He had no experience with official adoption procedures, no idea what obstacles he might face, and no guarantee that any of the children would even want to come with him. But he couldn't get Jim's words out of his head. Shame to break up a family like that. Thomas stared out at his empty pastures. Why are they being separated? Same reason they always are. Nobody wants 6 kids at once. Too expensive. Too much work. Easier to find homes for them 1 or 2 at a time. But they want to stay together? From what I heard, they fought it hard. Oldest boy Marcus. I think his name, has tried to convince the officials to let them be. Even got the little one to speak, and she ain't said a word since her parents died. But the county don't care about what children want. They care about what's practical. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The morning wind rustled through the cottonwood trees Margaret had planted when they were first married. She dreamed of children playing under those trees someday, of a house full of voices and laughter. How old are they? He asked. Oldest is 16, youngest is 4. Got 2 sets of twins and the middle boy's about 10. And then there's a girl around 8 and another around 13. 6 children. 6 children who were being torn apart today because no one believed a family could stay together when they had nothing but each other. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Jim asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer immediately. The idea forming in his mind was either the most generous thing he'd ever considered or the most foolish. Probably both. How long since the first wagon left for Bozeman? Jim consulted his pocket watch. Hour ago, maybe 2. "But Thomas, you can't be seriously considering. I have 6 empty bedrooms, Jim. I have more money than I know what to do with. I have land that could support 100 children if I had to. You also have a business to run and no experience raising children that aren't your own," Jim pointed out. 6 kids who've been through more trauma than most adults. That's not the same as having your own boys back. Thomas stood up abruptly. "Saddle a fresh horse, Jim. I'm riding to town." "Thomas, wait. Think about this. You can't just ride into Cedar Falls and demand they give you 6 children. That's not how adoption works. Then how does it work?" Jim ran a hand through his graying hair. "I don't know. But I know it involves paperwork and background checks and all sorts of official business. You can't just show up and watch me," Thomas said, already striding toward the barn. The ride to Cedar Falls took 45 minutes at a hard gallop. Thomas's mind raced faster than his horse's hooves. He had no plan beyond arriving at the orphanage and somehow convincing the authorities that 6 children belonged together, preferably with him. He had no experience with official adoption procedures, no idea what obstacles he might face, and no guarantee that any of the children would even want to come with him, but he couldn't get Jim's words out of his head. Shame to break up a family. Like that, Thomas had lost his family to forces beyond his control. These children were losing theirs to forces that could be controlled, if someone was willing to step in and take responsibility. The question was whether he had the courage to become that someone. Cedar Falls bustled with its usual midday activity when Thomas rode into town. The main street was lined with shops and businesses, horses and wagons moving in both directions, people going about their daily lives without any idea that 6 children's futures were being decided. Just a few blocks away, the orphanage sat on the edge of town, a large gray building that had once been a private mansion before being converted to house unwanted children. Thomas had never been inside, but he'd passed it countless times over the years, usually without giving it much thought. Today, he noticed everything: the peeling paint on the shutters, the thin curtains at the windows, the small yard where a few children played despite the winter cold. It looked like exactly what it was, a place where children waited for someone to want them. Thomas tied his horse to the fence and walked up the front steps. Through the windows he could see figures moving around inside, children and adults going about the business of institutional life. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What exactly was he planning to say? "Excuse me, I'd like to adopt 6 children I've never met because I don't like the idea of them being separated." It sounded ridiculous even in his own head. Before he could lose his nerve, the front door opened. A thin woman in a severe black dress looked him up and down with sharp eyes. "May I help you?" she asked in a tone that suggested she'd rather not. "I'm Thomas Brennan. I own the Double B Ranch about 50 miles east of here. I understand you have some children who are being relocated today." The woman's expression didn't change. "I'm Matron Caldwell." "Are you referring to the Hartwell children?" "Yes, ma'am. I heard they were being separated and sent to different families." "That's correct. The arrangements have all been finalized." "Is there something specific you needed?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I'd like to offer them a home. All of them, together." For the first time, Matron Caldwell's composed expression cracked slightly. She blinked, then stepped back from the door. "I beg your pardon? The Hartwell children. I'd like to adopt them. All 6 of them." Matron Caldwell stared at him for a long moment, then glanced over her shoulder into the building behind her. Mr. Brennan, I'm afraid you don't understand the situation. These children have already been placed with appropriate families. The legal paperwork has been filed, the arrangements made. The oldest boy left for Bozeman this morning. Thomas felt his heart sink. He's already gone? 2 hours ago. The girl Emma will be leaving for Great Falls shortly. I'm afraid your generous offer comes too late. What about the others? Matron Caldwell hesitated. Mr. Brennan, even if the timing were different, the county officials have very specific procedures for child placement. You can't simply appear and request 6 children without proper vetting, references, financial documentation. I have money, Thomas interrupted. I have land, a stable home, no debts. I can provide for them. It's not that simple. These children have special needs, having been through significant trauma. They require experienced care, not just financial resources. They require each other, Thomas said firmly. From what I understand, that's the one thing they're not getting. A commotion behind Matron Caldwell drew their attention. Thomas could hear children's voices, one of them crying, and adult voices trying to maintain order. Through the doorway, he caught a glimpse of a young girl with auburn hair being led toward what looked like a back exit, her face streaked with tears. Emma, someone was calling. The wagon is here, dear. Time to go. I want to see Marcus, the girl cried. I want to see my brothers and sisters. You'll see them again someday, an adult voice replied unconvincingly. Now come along. The Thorntons are waiting. Thomas watched as the girl Emma, he assumed, was guided out of sight, still protesting. The sound of her sobs echoed through the building, even after she disappeared. That child, Thomas said quietly, is being torn away from the only family. She has left. How is that in her best interest? Matron Caldwell's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Mr. Brennan, I understand your feelings. But the Thornton family specifically requested a daughter Emma's age. They have the means to provide her with education, proper clothes, a future she could never have here. Sometimes sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. Whose greater good? Before Matron Caldwell could answer, another voice called from inside the building. Mrs. Caldwell. The Henderson wagon just arrived for the twins and Sarah. Thomas felt desperation rising in his chest. How many are left? 4, Matron Caldwell sighed reluctantly. The twins Daniel and David, 8-year-old Sarah, and little Lucy. But Mr. Brennan, can I see them? Can I at least meet them before they're taken away? Matron Caldwell glanced around nervously. The county officials are here right now. They're processing the paperwork in town. I suppose a brief meeting wouldn't hurt. But you must understand. These arrangements are final. Nothing you say or do will change that. She led him through the front door into a large hallway lined with doors. The orphanage smelled of boiled cabbage and carbolic soap, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of too many people living in too small a space for too long. Children's voices echoed from various rooms, but the overall atmosphere was one of quiet resignation. The remaining Hartwell children are in the back parlor, Matron Caldwell explained as they walked. They've been difficult since Marcus and Emma left. Perhaps seeing that there are still people who care about their welfare will help them accept their new situations more gracefully. They reached a door at the end of the hall, and Matron Caldwell knocked softly before entering. Children, there's someone here who'd like to meet you. The room was small and cold, with a few mismatched chairs and a table scarred with years of use. 4 children sat huddled together on a worn sofa, 2 boys who were clearly twins. A girl with dark hair braided with string, and a tiny child with blonde curls who clung to the girl's dress. All 4 pairs of eyes turned toward Thomas with expressions of wariness and exhaustion. These children had learned not to trust adults who made promises, and their faces showed it. This is Mr. Brennan, Matron Caldwell said. He owns a ranch east of town. Thomas stepped forward slowly, the way he would approach a spooked horse. "You must be Daniel and David," he said to the twins. They were thin but sturdy-looking boys with intelligent eyes and identical expressions of protective suspicion. "I'm Daniel," one of them said quietly. "He's David." "And you're Sarah?" Thomas asked, looking at the dark-haired girl. She nodded but didn't speak, her arms wrapped protectively around the smallest child. "And this must be Lucy," Thomas said, crouching down to the little girl's eye level. She studied him with enormous blue eyes but kept her thumb firmly in her mouth. "Lucy doesn't talk," Sarah said defensively. "She's not stupid or anything. She just doesn't talk since Mama and Papa died. I understand," Thomas said gently. "Sometimes, when we lose people we love, words don't seem big enough to hold all the feelings." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, surprise, maybe, that an adult had understood something so complicated. "Where are Marcus and Emma?" David asked suddenly. "Are they coming back?" Matron Caldwell started to speak, but Thomas held up a hand. "They've gone to new families," he said honestly. "I know that's not what you wanted." "They promised we'd stay together," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. "Marcus promised." "Sometimes promises get broken, even when the people making them desperately want to keep them," Thomas said. "That doesn't mean the promise wasn't real when it was made." The children stared at him, clearly not used to adults who spoke to them, like they could handle difficult truths. "Mr. Brennan," Matron Caldwell interrupted, "the Henderson wagon will be here any moment for Daniel. David and Sarah, and the Millers from Missoula are expected tomorrow for Lucy." "What if they didn't have to go?" Thomas asked quietly, still looking at the children. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Thomas glanced at Matron Caldwell, who was shaking her head vigorously, then looked back at the 4 young faces watching him. With desperate hope, they were trying hard to hide. What if there was another option? What if there was a place where you could stay together? "There isn't," David said flatly. "We asked. Nobody wants 4 kids at once." "I do," Thomas said simply. Room went completely silent. Even Matron Caldwell stopped her objections. The children stared at Thomas like he'd just claimed he could make the sun rise in the west. "You want ... all of us?" Daniel asked carefully. "I want all 6 of you," Thomas said. "I know Marcus and Emma are already gone, but maybe we could find a way to bring them back too." Lucy pulled her thumb from her mouth for the first time and whispered, "Really?" It was the second word she'd spoken in 2 years, and it hit the room like a thunderclap. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. The twins leaned forward eagerly, and even Matron Caldwell looked stunned. "Really," Thomas said, making a promise he had no idea how to keep, but knowing he'd die trying. Outside, the sound of wagon wheels on gravel announced the arrival of another family coming to take children away from each other. But for the first time in days, the 4 remaining Hartwell children looked like they had something to hope for. Thomas Brennan had walked into the orphanage as a lonely man looking to fill the empty spaces in his house. But as he looked at 4 children who refused to give up on each other, he realized he might have found something much more important than he'd been looking for. He might have found his purpose, the sound of approaching wagon. Wheels shattered the fragile hope that had filled the orphanage parlor. Through the frost-covered window, Thomas could see a sturdy farm wagon pulled by 2 draft horses, with a middle-aged couple sitting on the front bench. The woman wore a practical wool coat and bonnet, while the man beside her had the weathered look of someone who worked the land for a living. "That's the Henderson wagon," Matron Caldwell said, her voice tight with authority returning. "Mr. Brennan, I'm afraid your visit must end now. Daniel, David, Sarah, gather your things. It's time to go." The 3 children didn't move. They sat frozen on the worn sofa, staring at Thomas with expressions that begged him to somehow make good on the impossible promise he'd just made. "Wait," Thomas said, stepping between the children and Matron Caldwell. "You said the county officials aren't here right now. That means no legal transfers can happen without their authorization, correct?" Matron Caldwell's eyes narrowed, Mr. Brennan, the paperwork has been filed. These arrangements are legitimate, but they haven't been finalized. Yet, Thomas pressed. Not until the officials return and complete the actual transfer of custody. A knock echoed through the orphanage's front door, followed by heavy footsteps in the hallway. The Henderson couple had arrived to claim their new children. Mrs. Caldwell? A man's voice called out, "We're here for the Henderson placement." Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He turned to the 4 children and spoke quickly but clearly. "Do you trust me?" 4 small heads nodded without hesitation. "Then when I tell you to, I want you to run. All of you, together, head for the back door and don't stop until you reach the creek behind the building." "Can you do that?" "But where will we go?" Sarah whispered. "Leave that to me. Just run when I say so, and stay together no matter what." Matron Caldwell started toward the parlor door to greet the Hendersons, but Thomas blocked her path. "Mrs. Caldwell, before you bring them in, I need to make you an offer. Mr. Brennan, this is highly irregular. $5,000, Thomas said quietly. Matron Caldwell stopped dead in her tracks. "I beg your pardon?" $5,000. As a donation to the orphanage, in exchange for allowing me to formally petition for custody of the remaining Hartwell children before any more transfers take place. It was more money than the orphanage saw in 2 years, and Thomas could see the calculation happening behind Matron Caldwell's eyes. $5,000 could buy coal for the winter, food for months, repairs to the building, clothes for every child in the institution. The county officials would never approve. Let me worry about the county officials. All I'm asking for is the chance to present my case before these children are separated forever. From the hallway came the sound of the Henderson couple growing impatient. "Mrs. Caldwell, is everything all right?" Thomas leaned closer to the matron and lowered his voice. "These children have already lost their parents, their home, and 2 of their siblings today. If you send them away now, you'll be responsible for destroying what's left of their family. Is that really what you want on your conscience?" For a moment, Matron Caldwell's stern facade cracked. Thomas saw something human flicker in her eyes, doubt, perhaps even compassion. But the moment passed quickly. "Mr. Brennan, you don't understand the realities of running an institution like this. These children need homes, and the Hendersons are good people who will provide." "Run," Thomas said quietly, never taking his eyes off Matron Caldwell. Behind him, 4 children erupted into motion. Daniel grabbed Sarah's hand, David scooped up Lucy, and they bolted for the back door of the parlor. Their footsteps thundered across the wooden floor as they fled toward the promised creek. "Stop them!" Matron Caldwell shouted, pushing past Thomas to pursue the children, but Thomas was faster. He caught her arm gently but firmly. "Let them go. Are you insane? They'll freeze to death out there. They'll be fine, and they'll be together." The commotion had attracted attention from throughout the orphanage. The Henderson couple appeared in the parlor doorway, looking confused and concerned. Other children peered around corners, wide-eyed at the unprecedented drama unfolding. "What's happening here?" Mr. Henderson asked. He was a stocky man with kind eyes and calloused hands. "We were told 3 children were ready for placement." "There's been a complication," Matron Caldwell said, shooting a furious look at Thomas. "The children have temporarily absconded." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her matronly face creased with worry. "They ran away? But why? Were they told we were coming for them?" "The children don't want to be separated from their remaining sibling," Thomas explained. "They've already lost 2 family members today, and they're scared of losing each other too." The Hendersons exchanged a look of understanding that spoke well of their character. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said slowly, "that does complicate things. We were specifically hoping for the twins and the 8-year-old girl. We have a farm that could use young hands, and we've been blessed with prosperity enough to provide for 3. Children. What about 4 children? Thomas asked. 4? Mr. Henderson looked puzzled. The twins, Sarah, and little Lucy. What if you took all 4 of them? They could stay together, and you'd have the family you were hoping for. Mrs. Henderson bit her lip thoughtfully. We hadn't considered the little one. She's so young. And she doesn't speak, Matron Caldwell added quickly. There may be developmental concerns. There are no developmental concerns, Thomas interrupted firmly. Lucy is a bright, healthy child who stopped talking when her parents died. That's trauma, not disability. Mr. Henderson stroked his beard. 4 children is a significant responsibility. But think about it, Thomas pressed. Siblings who've been through what these children have experienced. They'll work together, look out for each other, help each other heal. You won't just be getting 4 individual children. You'll be getting a family unit that's already bonded. Through the window, Thomas could see the 4 Hartwell children huddled together by the creek, just as he'd instructed. They were staying close to the building but out of immediate reach, waiting to see what would happen next. Where are the other 2 siblings? Mrs. Henderson asked. You mentioned they'd lost family members today. Matron Caldwell sighed. The oldest boy, Marcus, was taken to Bozeman this morning. The 13-year-old girl, Emma, left for Great Falls. An hour ago. Taken? Mrs. Henderson's voice sharpened. You mean they were separated against their will? The placements were arranged according to each family's specific requests, Matron Caldwell said defensively. Not every family can accommodate 6 children. Mrs. Henderson looked at her husband with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. They seemed to be having an entire conversation without words, the way couples married for many years could do. Finally, Mr. Henderson spoke. Martha and I lost our own children to scarlet fever 5 years ago. 3 little ones, all within a week. His voice was steady, but Thomas heard the old pain underneath. We know what it means to have a family torn apart. George, Mrs. Henderson said quietly, laying a hand on her husband's arm. We came here today thinking we'd give 3 children a home, Mr. Henderson continued. But maybe God has something different in mind. Maybe he wants us to help keep a family together instead of inadvertently helping tear one apart. Thomas felt a spark of hope, but he forced himself to remain calm. Are you saying you'd consider taking all 4 children? We're saying we'd like to meet them properly, Mrs. Henderson said. All 4 of them, together. If they're willing to come with us as a family unit, then perhaps that's what's meant to be. Matron Caldwell looked like she wanted to object, but the arrival of heavy footsteps in the hallway forestalled any argument. 2 men in official coats appeared in the doorway, the county representatives Thomas had heard about. Mrs. Caldwell. The taller man said, consulting his pocket watch, we're here to finalize the Henderson placement and prepare for tomorrow's Missoula transfer. Are the children ready? The room fell silent. Thomas realized this was the moment of truth. Either the bureaucratic machinery would grind forward with its predetermined plan, or someone would have the courage to stop it. Actually, Mrs. Henderson said, stepping forward with surprising authority, my husband and I would like to modify our placement request. The county official blinked. Modify it how? We'd like to petition for all 4 remaining Hartwell children. Not just the 3 originally assigned to us. The second official, a younger man with wire-rimmed spectacles, frowned. That's highly irregular. The placements have been carefully arranged, and they can be carefully rearranged, Thomas interrupted, moving to stand beside the Hendersons, especially when it serves the best interests of the children involved. And you are? The tall official asked. Thomas Brennan. I own the Double B Ranch, and I'm also petitioning for custody of these children. The officials exchanged glances that spoke of long experience with complicated situations. Gentlemen, the younger man said, we have legal obligations here. The Hartwell children have been assessed and placed according to territorial guidelines. We can't simply restructure everything because of last-minute requests. Even when those Request serve the children's welfare better than the original plan? Mrs. Henderson asked pointedly. Through the window, Thomas saw Lucy stumble and fall by the creek. Sarah immediately helped her up, brushing snow from her coat and pulling her close for warmth. The image of the children taking care of each other in the cold was more persuasive than any argument he could make. "Look," Thomas said, gesturing toward the window. "Those children ran away rather than be separated. They're sitting in the snow together because they'd rather face hardship as a family than comfort apart. How is breaking them up serving their best interests?" The tall official moved to the window and observed the scene by the creek. His expression softened slightly as he watched David remove his own coat to wrap around Sarah's shoulders. "Where are the other two siblings?" he asked quietly. "Already separated and sent away," Thomas said. "This morning to Bozeman, this afternoon to Great Falls, against the children's wishes and without regard for the trauma it would cause." The official was quiet for a long moment, watching the children outside. Finally, he turned back to the room. "In 20 years of child placement work," he said slowly, "I've seen too many families destroyed by well-meaning bureaucracy. Sometimes the rules serve the system better than they serve the children." His younger colleague looked alarmed. "Sir, we have procedures. We also have discretion," the senior official replied firmly. "Mrs. Henderson, you're willing to take all 4 children?" "We are," she said without hesitation. "And Mr. Brennan, what exactly is your interest in this situation?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I'm a widower with a large ranch and no children of my own. I have the means to provide for 6 children and the desire to keep this family together. If the Hendersons are willing to take 4 of them, I'd like to work toward reuniting all 6 siblings eventually." "You want to adopt children you've never met?" "I want to do what's right. These children have been through enough loss. They shouldn't lose each other too." The younger official looked skeptical. "Mr. Brennan, child adoption isn't a rescue mission. These children need stable, experienced parents, not someone motivated by sentiment." "I'm not motivated by sentiment," Thomas said quietly. "I'm motivated by the belief that family is the most important thing we have, and that when we have the power to preserve it, we should." The senior official studied Thomas for a long moment. "What did you do before ranching, Mr. Brennan?" "I was a teacher in Colorado before I moved to Montana. I taught children ages 6 through 16 for 8 years. This was the first time." Thomas had mentioned his teaching background, and it clearly surprised everyone in the room. Matron Caldwell's eyebrows rose, and even the skeptical younger official looked intrigued. "You have experience with children?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "I do. And I know that the most important thing you can teach a child is that they're worth fighting for. These 6 children are worth fighting for." Outside, the 4 Hartwell siblings had moved closer to the building, clearly cold but unwilling to separate. Lucy had wrapped her arms around Sarah's neck, and the twins flanked them protectively. The senior official made his decision. "Mrs. Henderson, if you're willing to take all 4 children, we can modify the paperwork. Mr. Brennan, reuniting separated siblings is a complex legal process, but it's not impossible if you're serious about pursuing it." "I'm serious," Thomas said immediately. "Then we'll need to conduct proper interviews, background checks, home inspections." "How long will that take?" Thomas asked. "For emergency placement modifications, we can expedite the process, perhaps a week for preliminary approval." Thomas felt a surge of hope, but then reality set in. "What about Marcus and Emma? They're already gone." The official considered this. "If both receiving families are willing to return the children pending proper family reunification, and if suitable alternative arrangements can be made ... He paused. "It would be unprecedented, but not impossible. Will you help us?" Mrs. Henderson asked. The senior official looked around the room at Matron Caldwell's conflicted expression, at the Hendersons' determined faces, at Thomas's hopeful eyes, and finally out the window at 4 children who'd chosen cold and uncertainty over separation. "I'll make some very unusual phone calls," he said finally, "but I can't promise anything." As if summoned by the conversation, the 4 Hartwell children appeared at the parlor's back door, faces red with cold, but eyes bright with desperate hope. "Can we come in now?" Sarah asked quietly. "We're ready to hear what happens next." Thomas looked at these 4 brave children who'd risked everything to stay together, then at the adults who held their future in their hands. "Come in," he said. "Let's figure this out together." For the first time since their parents died, the Hartwell children were about to discover that sometimes adults meant it when they promised to fight for what was right. The Double B Ranch sprawled before them in the amber light of late afternoon, and Thomas watched the 4 Hartwell children take in their new surroundings with wide, uncertain eyes. It had been 3 days since the dramatic confrontation at the orphanage, 3 days of paperwork and interviews and legal maneuvering that had finally resulted in temporary custody being granted to both Thomas and the Henderson family. The Hendersons had taken Daniel and David to their farm 15 miles south, with the understanding that the twins would visit the ranch regularly while the complicated process of full family reunification continued. Sarah and Lucy had come home with Thomas, and now they sat in his wagon, taking their first look at what might become their permanent home. "It's big," Sarah said quietly, her dark eyes scanning the rolling pastures where cattle grazed in the distance. "Bigger than I thought a ranch would be." Lucy, still clinging to Sarah's hand, pointed toward the barn where several horses stood in the corral. She didn't speak, but her eyes held a spark of interest that Thomas hadn't seen before. "Those are working horses," Thomas explained as he guided the wagon up the dirt road toward the house. "That bay mare is Stella. She's gentle enough for children to ride, if you're interested in learning." Sarah's face lit up with cautious excitement. "We could learn to ride horses?" "If you want to, no pressure, but it's a useful skill on a ranch." The house came into view, and Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The 2-story structure was well built and comfortable, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the afternoon sun. But it was also the house where Margaret had played piano, where his boys had chased each other through the halls, where laughter had once echoed from every room. Now it stood silent, waiting to see if it could become a home for children again. Jim Carlisle emerged from the barn as the wagon approached, wiping his hands on a feed sack. The foreman had been skeptical about Thomas's impulsive decision to take in 2 traumatized children, but he'd agreed to help however he could. "Afternoon, Thomas," Jim said, tipping his hat toward the wagon. "These must be the young ladies we've been hearing about." "Jim Carlisle, meet Sarah and Lucy Hartwell," Thomas said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "Sarah, Lucy, this is Jim. He helps run the ranch." Sarah offered a small smile, but Lucy pressed closer to her sister, still overwhelmed by all the new faces and places. "Pleasure to meet you both," Jim said with the gentle tone he used around skittish horses. "Lucy, I've got a barn cat named Patches who's been looking for someone to help her catch mice. Think you might be interested in meeting her?" For the first time since leaving the orphanage, Lucy showed a flicker of genuine interest. She nodded shyly, still not speaking, but clearly intrigued by the idea of a cat. Thomas carried their few belongings, a small satchel that held everything the girls owned, up to the front porch. The house felt different as he opened the door, knowing that children would be living in it again. Different, but not wrong. "This is the main room," he said, leading them inside. The parlor was comfortable but clearly masculine leather chairs, a stone fireplace, hunting prints on the walls. Margaret's piano still sat in the corner, covered by its dust cloth. Sarah's gaze lingered on the covered piano. "What's under the cloth?" Thomas hesitated. He hadn't touched that piano in 3 years, hadn't heard music in this house since Margaret died. "It's a piano," My wife used to play it. Used to? Sarah asked with the directness that children possessed. She died 3 years ago, along with my 2 boys. The simple statement hung in the air. Sarah's expression softened with understanding. She knew about losing parents, about houses that felt empty after people you loved were gone. I'm sorry, she said quietly. It must make you sad to look at it. Sometimes, Thomas admitted. But maybe it won't always. He showed them through the kitchen, where the cook stove was already warming for dinner, and up the stairs to the bedrooms he'd hastily prepared. Sarah would have the room that had belonged to his sons, while Lucy would sleep in the smaller room next door, that he'd originally planned as a nursery before Margaret got sick. These rooms are just for us? Sarah asked, running her hand along the windowsill of her bedroom. Just for you. You can arrange things however you like, decorate them if you want. Make them your own. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, the first real bed she'd slept in since her parents died. The mattress was soft, the quilts warm and clean. After 2 years of orphanage dormitories, the privacy and comfort felt almost overwhelming. Lucy explored her room with cautious curiosity, touching the carved wooden horse that Thomas had placed on the dresser, testing the rocking chair by the window. She discovered a child-sized wash basin and pitcher, painted with tiny blue flowers, and her eyes went wide with delight. That was for ... Thomas started to say it had been for the children he and Margaret had hoped to have, then stopped. These were those children now, in a way he'd never expected. That's yours now. That evening, Thomas attempted to cook dinner with mixed results. He was competent with basic meals, beef, bread, but trying to prepare something that might appeal to children while also being nutritious proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. Sarah watched him struggle with the unfamiliar territory of child-friendly cooking. I can help, she offered tentatively. I used to help Mama cook before the fire. I'd appreciate that, Thomas said, relieved. What do you think Lucy might like? She likes soft things. Eggs if you have them, milk. At the orphanage, she mostly ate the bread and left the rest. Working together, they managed to prepare scrambled eggs, fresh bread with butter, and milk that was still warm from the morning milking. Lucy ate more than Thomas had seen her consume at the orphanage, and Sarah seemed to relax as she took on the familiar role of caring for her little sister. After dinner, as the sun set behind the mountains, they sat on the front porch. The evening air was cool but not cold, filled with the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and night birds calling from the cottonwood trees. Mr. Brennan, Sarah said, using the formal address despite the informal setting. What's going to happen to Marcus and Emma? It was the question Thomas had been dreading. The legal process of reuniting separated siblings was complex and uncertain, requiring cooperation from multiple families and jurisdictions. The senior county official had been true to his word about making unusual phone calls, but results were still pending. I don't know yet, Thomas said honestly. The officials are working on it, but it's complicated. The families who took them have rights too, and Marcus and Emma might have started settling in. Emma won't settle, Sarah said with certainty. She'd be sad every day until we're together again. And Marcus ... Marcus will blame himself for not protecting us better. The weight of responsibility that 16-year-old Marcus had carried for his siblings was something Thomas understood all too well. He'd felt that same burden as a teacher, knowing that children's futures often depended on the decisions adults made on their behalf. We'll keep trying, Thomas promised. I won't stop working to bring your family back together. Lucy, who had been quietly petting Patches the barn cat on her lap, suddenly looked up at Thomas with her serious blue eyes. In a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Thank you." It was only the 3rd time she'd spoken since her parents died, and both Thomas and Sarah felt the significance of the moment. This small child, who had been through so much trauma, was beginning to trust again, The next morning brought new challenges and small victories. Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit, but found Sarah already in the kitchen, trying to light the stove to help with breakfast. She'd clearly been doing this kind of work at the orphanage, taking care of Lucy and contributing however she could. "You don't have to do that," Thomas said gently. "You're not a servant here, Sarah. You're family." Sarah paused in her work, looking confused. "But who will take care of things? Who will make sure Lucy eats enough and gets her hair braided properly and has clean clothes? We'll figure it out together. All of us. Lucy is your sister, but she's also my responsibility now. You don't have to carry all that weight by yourself." It was a concept that seemed foreign to Sarah, the idea that an adult would share the burden of caring for her younger sister instead of expecting her to handle it alone. She'd been 8 years old when their parents died, and she'd been acting like a little mother ever since. "At the orphanage," she said slowly, "the older children always had to take care of the younger ones. There weren't enough adults." "This isn't the orphanage," Thomas said. "Here, children get to be children." The morning routine gradually established itself. Thomas showed Sarah how to collect eggs from the chickens, while Lucy watched from a safe distance, clearly fascinated by the birds but too timid to approach them. He taught them both how to milk the gentler cows, and Lucy actually giggled, when one of the calves tried to suckle her. Jim arrived with news that lifted everyone's spirits. "Got word from the Henderson place," he announced. "Over breakfast. The twins are doing well. Mrs. Henderson says Daniel's already figured out how to fix their broken wagon wheel, and David's got all their farm cats following him around like he's the Pied Piper." "Can we see them?" Sarah asked. "Eagerly. This afternoon," Thomas promised. "We'll ride over and check on them." The reunion with Daniel and David was emotional but healing. The 4 Hartwell children clung to each other for several minutes, reassuring themselves that they were all still safe and together in spirit, even if they were living in different places temporarily. The Henderson farm was prosperous and well-run, with neat fields and sturdy buildings. Martha Henderson had clearly taken to the boys immediately, fussing over them with the affection of someone who'd missed having children in her house. George Henderson was teaching them practical skills while treating them with respect due to young men rather than charity cases. "We like it here," Daniel told Sarah and Lucy privately while the adults talked. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson are kind, and they don't make us feel like we're burdens. But we miss you. We miss all of us being together." "Soon," Sarah said with the faith that children could muster even in difficult circumstances. "Mr. Brennan is working to bring Marcus and Emma back. We'll all be together soon." That evening, back at the ranch, Lucy made another breakthrough. She approached Thomas while he was reading in the parlor and climbed into his lap without invitation, curling up against his chest like a small cat seeking warmth. She didn't say anything, but her trust was evident in the way she relaxed completely against him. Sarah watched this development with something like relief. "She used to do that with Papa," she said softly. "Before he died, she would climb into his lap every evening and fall asleep there." Thomas felt the weight and warmth of the small child in his arms, remembered the feeling of holding James and Joseph when they were small. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was accompanied now by something else, the possibility of new love, different but equally real. "Sarah," he said carefully, "how would you feel about learning to read music? If we uncovered the piano?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Really? You'd let me try?" "I think it's time that the piano made music again. What do you think?" The next morning, they uncovered Margaret's piano together. The instrument was beautiful, a cherry wood upright with ivory keys that gleamed in the morning sunlight. Sarah ran her fingers over the keys with reverence, producing tentative notes that filled the house with sound for the first time in 3 years. Thomas found Margaret's old music books and began teaching Sarah simple scales and basic songs. Lucy sat nearby, listening with fascination as music returned to their home. It wasn't the same as when Margaret played. Sarah's technique was beginner level and sometimes discordant, but it was alive and hopeful in a way that felt entirely right. "When Emma comes back," Sarah said as she practiced, "she'll want to learn too. She always loved singing." "Then we'll teach her," Thomas promised. "We'll teach all of you anything you want to learn." As the days passed, the house began to feel lived in again. Sarah's attempts at cooking improved with practice, and she took pride in contributing to their daily routines. Lucy spoke more frequently, usually single words or short phrases, but each utterance felt like a small celebration. Thomas found himself adapting to the rhythms of life with children, earlier bedtimes, different meal schedules, the constant awareness that two young lives depended on his decisions. But rather than feeling burdened, he felt purposeful in a way he hadn't experienced since his teaching days. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah asked the question that had been on all their minds. "Mr. Brennan, what if we can't get Marcus and Emma back? What if they have to stay with those other families forever?" Thomas considered his answer carefully. These children had faced enough loss and disappointment. They deserved honesty, but also hope. "Then we'll love the family we have," he said finally, "and we'll never stop trying to make it whole again." Family isn't just about living in the same house, Sarah. It's about never giving up on each other. Lucy, who had been quiet during the conversation, suddenly stood up and walked to Thomas's chair. She climbed into his lap and wrapped her small arms around his neck. "Daddy Thomas," she whispered. It was the longest sentence she'd spoken since her parents died, and it changed everything. Not because Thomas was replacing her father, no one could do that, but because she was ready to trust again, to believe that adults could be safe and loving and permanent. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. "Daddy Thomas," she repeated, testing how the words felt. Thomas held Lucy close and reached out to include Sarah in the embrace. "Love you both," he said. "And I promise you, we're going to bring this family back together." For the first time since their parents died, the Hartwell children were beginning to believe that promises could be kept, and that families could be rebuilt even after they'd been broken. The piano music that drifted from the house that evening carried across the Montana prairie, a song of healing that had only just begun. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider from town whose horse was lathered with sweat from the urgent journey. Thomas read the yellow paper twice before the words fully registered, his coffee growing cold as the implication sank in. Mitchell family refuses return of Marcus Hartwell. Stop claim legal adoption finalized. Stop boy settling well. Stop recommend. No further contact. Esto P. Jim Carlisle watched Thomas's face change as he read. "Bad news?" Thomas handed him the telegram without speaking. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Sarah practicing piano in the parlor, her fingers picking out a simple melody that Margaret had once played. "What about the girl?" Jim asked quietly. "Emma? No word yet from Great Falls." Thomas crumpled the telegram in his fist. "But if the Mitchell family is refusing to cooperate, ... He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what it meant. The dream of reuniting the Hartwell siblings was falling apart before it had truly begun. Marcus, the protective older brother, who had promised his siblings they'd stay together, was being kept from them by people who viewed him as their property now that the legal papers were signed. Sarah's piano playing stopped abruptly. Through the window, Thomas could see her standing in the parlor, her young face pressed against the glass as she watched his conversation with Jim. Even at 8 years old, she was learning to read the expressions of adults and understand when something was wrong. Thomas walked inside, still holding the crumpled telegram. Sarah met him at the parlor door. Lucy closed behind her, thumb in mouth as always when she sensed tension. "What's wrong, Daddy Thomas?" Sarah asked. The name she'd begun using coming naturally. Now. Thomas had learned that these children responded better to truth than to false reassurance. They'd lived through too much uncertainty to be comforted by empty promises. "We heard from the family that took Marcus," he said, sitting down so he could look at them at eye level. "They don't want to let him come back to us." Sarah's face went pale. "What do you mean they don't want to? He's our brother. They've decided they want to keep him as their own son. They think he's better off with them, but he's not." Sarah's voice rose with the kind of passionate certainty that only children possessed. "He belongs with us. We're his family." Lucy pulled her thumb from her mouth and whispered, "Where Marcus?" The simple question broke Thomas's heart. How could he explain to a 4-year-old that adults she'd never met had decided her brother belonged to them now, regardless of what she or Marcus wanted? Before Thomas could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a fancy carriage pulled by matching gray horses, followed by a second wagon carrying several men in dark suits. "Expecting company?" Jim asked, appearing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Thomas wasn't expecting anyone, and the formal nature of the visitors sent a chill down his spine. Official carriages usually brought official problems. The lead carriage stopped in front of the house, and a well-dressed woman emerged, followed by a portly man with a gold watch chain across his vest. The men in the second wagon remained seated, but alert, their hands resting on papers and legal documents. Thomas stepped onto the porch, instinctively positioning himself between the visitors and the children. "Can I help you folks?" The woman was perhaps 50 years old, with iron gray hair and the kind of expensive clothes that spoke of wealth and social position. Her gaze swept over the ranch with the calculating look of someone assessing property values. "Mr. Brennan?" "I'm Mrs. Victoria Whitmore from the Montana Territory Children's Welfare Review Board. This is my colleague, Mr. Aldrich from the legal department." Thomas had never heard of the Children's Welfare Review Board, and the formal introduction set off warning bells in his mind. "What can I do for you?" Mrs. Whitmore consulted a leather folder thick with papers. "We're here to conduct an investigation into the irregular placement of minor children that occurred at the Cedar Falls orphanage last week." "Irregular how?" "Mr. Brennan, our office has received complaints that proper procedures were not followed in the placement of the Hartwell children. Questions have been raised about your qualifications as a guardian and the appropriateness of separating siblings who should have remained together." Thomas felt the irony of the situation like a physical blow. These people were investigating him for trying to keep the children together, while other officials had separated them in the first place. The placement was approved by county officials, Thomas said carefully. All proper procedures were followed. Mr. Aldrich stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of legal training. "Mr. Brennan, we have reports that you interfered with scheduled adoptions, encouraged children to flee from legal guardians, and made unauthorized financial offers to influence placement decisions." Behind Thomas, he could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath. The children were listening to every word, learning that the safety they'd begun to feel was being threatened once again. "Who filed these complaints?" Thomas asked. Mrs. Whitmore's smile was thin and cold. "That information is confidential. However, I can tell you that concerns have been raised about a single man attempting to adopt multiple children without proper family structure or feminine guidance." "And what about the Henderson family?" "They took 2 of the children through the same process." "The Hendersons are a married couple with established community ties and references," Mr. Aldrich replied. "Their situation is quite different from yours." Thomas was beginning to understand. Someone with influence had decided that his guardianship of Sarah and Lucy was inappropriate or threatening, and they were using official channels to challenge it. "I'd like to see these children," Mrs. Whitmore announced, moving toward the front door as if she had every right to enter his home. "Do you have a warrant?" Thomas asked, not moving aside. "Mr. Brennan," Mr. Aldrich said with the tone of someone accustomed to intimidating people with legal authority. This is an official welfare investigation. Refusing to cooperate will only make things worse for you and the children. Thomas felt trapped between protecting the children's sense of security and avoiding actions that could be used against him later. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped aside. Mrs. Whitmore swept into the parlor where Sarah and Lucy stood close together near the piano. Her sharp gaze took in every detail: the sheet music scattered on the piano bench, the children's simple but clean clothes, the comfortable but masculine furnishings. "And you must be Sarah and Lucy," she said in the kind of artificially sweet voice that children always saw through immediately. Sarah lifted her chin with a defiance that reminded Thomas of her older brother Marcus. "Yes, ma'am." "Are you being well cared for here, dear?" "Yes, ma'am. Daddy Thomas takes good care of us." Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows rose at the informal address. "Daddy Thomas? And how long have you known Mr. Brennan?" 2 weeks, Sarah answered honestly. "I see. And where do you sleep?" "In my own room, with my own bed and my own wash basin." "And Lucy? Does she speak for herself?" Lucy pressed closer too. Sarah but managed a whispered, "Yes." Mrs. Whitmore made notes in her leather folder. "Mr. Brennan, these children have experienced significant trauma. They require specialized care, preferably in a traditional family environment with both maternal and paternal figures." "They're receiving excellent care," Thomas replied, his patience beginning to fray. "They're safe, healthy, and beginning to heal from their trauma. But are they receiving appropriate feminine guidance, proper moral instruction? These are growing girls who need the influence of a mother figure." Sarah's voice cut through the adult conversation with startling clarity. "We had a mother. She died in the fire with Papa. Nobody can replace her, and nobody needs to." The room fell silent. Mrs. Whitmore clearly hadn't expected such direct resistance from an 8-year-old child. "Dear," she said in her patronizing tone, "children need guidance from adults who understand their proper roles in society. Daddy Thomas understands our roles." Sarah interrupted. "Our role is to be children. His role is to take care of us and love us and help us be a family again." Mr. Aldrich cleared his throat. "Mr. Brennan will need to conduct a thorough inspection of the premises, review your financial records, and interview the children separately." "No," Sarah said flatly. "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice sharpened. "You can't interview us separately. We stay together. That's what families do." Lucy nodded emphatically, her small hand clutching Sarah's dress. Thomas felt a surge of pride at the children's strength, but also fear for what this investigation might mean for their future. "What exactly are you investigating?" Mrs. Whitmore's mask of official politeness began to slip. "Mr. Brennan, there are serious questions about whether you can provide an appropriate environment for these children. A single man living alone, no matter how well-intentioned, simply cannot offer what a traditional family can provide, such as proper supervision, moral guidance, preparation for their future roles as wives and mothers." "Their future roles," Thomas interrupted, "are whatever they choose to make them, just like any child should be." "Mr. Brennan, you clearly don't understand the complexities of raising young ladies. I understand that these children have been through enough disruption. They're finally beginning to feel safe and loved, and you want to tear that away from them based on some arbitrary idea of what constitutes a proper family." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Sarah moved closer to Thomas, and Lucy wrapped her arms around his leg in a gesture of protection and trust that spoke louder than any testimony could. Mrs. Whitmore observed this display with obvious disapproval. "Mr. Brennan, we have reports that you've been teaching these children inappropriate skills for their gender and station, such as farm work, manual labor. These girls should be learning domestic skills, needlework, proper deportment. They're learning to be capable." Independent people, Thomas said firmly. They're learning that they don't have to be helpless. That attitude is precisely what concerns us, Mr. Aldrich interjected. These children need structure, discipline, and proper guidance about their future roles in society. Sarah had heard. Enough. She stepped forward with the courage that had sustained her family through 2 years of hardship. Our future roles, she said, her young voice ringing with conviction, are to be together. As a family. With Daddy Thomas and Daniel and David, and someday with Marcus and Emma again. That's our role, and that's what we choose. Lucy nodded and, in the strongest voice she'd used since her parents died, said, "We stay together." Mrs. Whitmore looked between the children and Thomas, clearly frustrated that her authority was being challenged by an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old who refused to be intimidated. "Mr. Brennan," she said coldly, "we'll be conducting a full investigation of this placement. Until that investigation is complete, these children will need to be placed in alternative care." Alternative care? Thomas felt the bottom drop out of his world. "You mean you're taking them away?" "We're ensuring their welfare while proper procedures are followed." "No," Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. "You can't take us away. We just found our family." Lucy began to cry, the first tears Thomas had seen from her since she'd arrived at the ranch. The sound was heartbreaking, a small child who had finally begun to trust, facing the prospect of being abandoned again. "These children are legally in my custody," Thomas said, fighting to keep his voice level. "You can't just take them without due process." "The due process," Mr. Aldrich said, with cold satisfaction, "is exactly what we're providing." As the officials prepared to remove Sarah and Lucy from the only stable home they'd known in 2 years, Thomas realized that the greatest threat to their family wasn't poverty or hardship or even official bureaucracy. It was people who believed that their narrow ideas about family and society mattered more than the love and healing these children had finally found. But as he looked at Sarah's determined face and heard Lucy's whispered declaration that they would stay together, Thomas knew that this family had already survived worse challenges than Mrs. Whitmore and her review board. They had survived because they refused to give up on each other, and they weren't about to start now. The sound of approaching hoofbeats at dawn shattered the uneasy peace that had settled over the Double B Ranch. Thomas bolted upright in bed, immediately alert. 3 days had passed since Mrs. Whitmore's threatening visit. 3 days of waiting for the other shoe to drop while trying to maintain normalcy for Sarah and Lucy. Through his bedroom window, he could see riders silhouetted against the pale morning sky. Too many riders for a social call, moving with the purposeful urgency of an official delegation. His heart sank as he recognized the lead horse carrying Mrs. Whitmore's unmistakable rigid posture. Sarah appeared in his doorway, already dressed despite the early hour. Her face was pale but determined, and Thomas realized she'd been watching for this moment just as he had. "They're back," she said simply. "I know. Go get Lucy and bring her to my room. Whatever happens, you two stay together." Sarah nodded and disappeared down the hall with the quiet efficiency she'd developed during their weeks together. Thomas dressed quickly, his mind racing through possible options. He'd spent the last 3 days consulting with a lawyer in Cedar Falls, but the legal realities were stark. Mrs. Whitmore's review board had significant authority, and challenging their decisions could take months or even years. Lucy appeared in the doorway, clutching her wooden horse carving and looking small in her white nightgown. Sarah guided her to the window where they could see the gathering delegation. "Below, how many are there?" Sarah asked. Thomas counted quickly. 8 riders, plus Mrs. Whitmore's carriage. The delegation was larger than before, clearly intended to prevent any resistance. Among the riders, Thomas recognized the uniform of the Territorial Sheriff's Office. Mrs. Whitmore had brought legal enforcement to ensure compliance with whatever orders she carried. "Daddy Thomas," Lucy whispered, "are they going to take us away?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Thomas knelt beside the little girl, taking her small hands in his calloused ones. "They're going to try," he said honestly. "But I'm not going to let them separate us without a fight." Sarah squared her shoulders with the same determination she'd shown when facing the county officials at the orphanage. "What kind of fight?" Before Thomas could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the house. The sound was followed immediately by Mrs. Whitmore's authoritative voice calling from the front porch, "Mr. Brennan, by order of the Montana Territory Children's Welfare Review Board, you are required to surrender custody of the minor children, Sarah and Lucy Hartwell, immediately." Thomas looked at the two children who had become his daughters in every way that mattered. Sarah's jaw was set with fierce determination, while Lucy pressed close to his side, her thumb back in her mouth, but her eyes alert and trusting. "Listen to me carefully," Thomas said quietly. "No matter what happens down there, remember that we are a family. Not because of papers or laws or what other people say, but because we chose each other. Can you remember that?" Both girls nodded solemnly. "Good. Now, let's go face this together." They walked downstairs as a unit, Sarah holding Lucy's hand while Thomas kept a protective arm around both girls. The front door was already being tested by impatient knocking. When they reached the main floor, Thomas opened the door to find Mrs. Whitmore flanked by two sheriff's deputies and the same Mr. Aldrich from her previous visit. Behind them, additional riders waited with an official wagon, clearly intended to transport the children. "Mr. Brennan," Mrs. Whitmore announced formally, "our investigation has concluded that this placement is not in the best interests of these children. You are hereby ordered to surrender custody immediately." "On what grounds?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew that Mr. Aldrich unfolded a legal document. "Improper guardianship structure, failure to provide appropriate moral and domestic instruction, and evidence of deliberate interference with established adoption procedures." "In other words," Thomas said coldly, "you disapprove of my lifestyle and my methods. We disapprove of a situation that places vulnerable children in an environment lacking proper supervision and guidance," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "These girls require the influence of a maternal figure and instruction in appropriate feminine roles." Sarah stepped forward, her 8-year-old voice carrying remarkable strength. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I ask you something?" The older woman looked surprised but nodded. "Do you have children of your own?" "That's not relevant to, do you?" Sarah pressed. Mrs. Whitmore's lips tightened. "No, I do not." "Then how do you know what children need better than someone who's actually taking care of us?" The question hung in the air with uncomfortable truth. Mr. Aldrich cleared his throat and gestured to the deputies. "Mr. Brennan, we don't want to make this more difficult than necessary. Please gather the children's belongings so we can proceed." "Where are you taking them?" Thomas asked. "They'll be placed in appropriate temporary care while suitable families are identified," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Families with proper structure and moral guidance." Lucy pulled her thumb from her mouth and looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore. "I don't want proper structure. I want Daddy Thomas." "Child, you don't understand what's best for you." "Yes, I do," Lucy said with startling clarity. "I understand that Daddy Thomas makes me feel safe. I understand that Sarah helps me not be scared. I understand that we're supposed to be together." Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Lucy, there are things children can't understand about what makes a proper home." "I understand plenty," Sarah interrupted. "I understand that you want to take us away from someone who loves us and give us to strangers who think they know better. I understand that you care more about your rules than about what makes children happy." One of the sheriff's deputies stepped forward uncomfortably. "Ma'am, maybe we should consider following the law," Mrs. Whitmore snapped. "Mr. Brennan, you have 5 minutes to gather their possessions." Thomas felt desperation rising in his chest. Legal challenges would take too long. And once the children were removed from his custody, getting them back would be nearly impossible. He needed a different strategy. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "what if I could address your concerns about proper guidance and moral instruction?" "Mr. Brennan, a single man cannot provide. What if I wasn't single?" The words left Thomas's mouth before he'd fully thought them through, but as soon as he spoke them, he realized they might be the only solution that could keep his family together. Mrs. Whitmore frowned. "I don't understand. You're concerned about the lack of feminine influence and maternal guidance. What if that could be provided?" Sarah looked up at Thomas with confusion and hope warring in her young face. Lucy clung tighter to his leg, sensing that something important was happening but not understanding what. Mr. Aldrich consulted his papers. "Mr. Brennan, are you suggesting you have marriage prospects that could address our concerns?" Thomas's mind raced. The idea was desperate, possibly foolish, but it might be the only way to prevent Sarah and Lucy from being torn away from the stability they'd finally found. "I'm suggesting that the concerns about proper family structure could be addressed, if the right person was willing to help provide it." Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew skeptical. "And you have someone in mind?" "I might." It was a complete bluff, but Thomas was buying time to think. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered conversations with neighbors, mentions of women in the territory who might be sympathetic to his situation. The Henderson family had spoken of a schoolteacher friend, a widow with her own understanding of loss and children's needs. "Mr. Brennan," one of the deputies said quietly, "if you're talking about a sham marriage just to keep custody, I'm talking about finding a solution that serves everyone's interests." Thomas said firmly, "The children's need for stability, your department's need for proper procedures, and my commitment to keeping this family together." Sarah tugged on Thomas's sleeve. When he looked down, she whispered, "Daddy Thomas, you don't have to marry someone. Just for us." The selflessness in her young voice nearly broke his heart. Here was a child who had lost everything, finally found safety and love, and was still more concerned about his happiness than her own security. "Sarah," he said gently, "sometimes the things we do for family turn out to be the best things we ever do for ourselves." Mrs. Whitmore was growing impatient. "Mr. Brennan, this is highly irregular. We can't delay official proceedings based on hypothetical solutions. Give me 1 week," Thomas said. 1 week to address your concerns about family structure and feminine guidance. If I can't satisfy your requirements, I'll surrender custody without further resistance." "Absolutely not," Mr. Aldrich began, but Mrs. Whitmore held up a hand. "What exactly are you proposing?" 1 week to arrange proper family structure. If I succeed, the children stay with me under appropriate supervision. If I fail, they go to whatever placement you've arranged. Mrs. Whitmore studied Thomas's face, clearly trying to determine if this was a genuine offer or a desperate delaying tactic. "And the children would remain here during this week?" "Under your supervision, if necessary. Daily visits, whatever oversight you require." Sarah and Lucy listened to this negotiation with the intense focus of children whose entire future hung in the balance. Lucy's grip on Thomas's leg had grown so tight her knuckles were white. After a long moment, Mrs. Whitmore made her decision. 1 week, Mr. Brennan, but with conditions. Daily inspections, documentation of progress toward appropriate family structure, and absolute compliance with our supervision requirements." "Agreed. And if you fail to meet these requirements, the children will be placed elsewhere without further contest from me." It was a terrible gamble, but it was the only chance Thomas could see to keep his family together. As the officials prepared to leave, setting schedules for their daily inspections, Sarah looked up at him with eyes full of questions. "Daddy Thomas, do you really know someone who might marry you?" Thomas knelt down to look at both girls. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. But I know this, I will do whatever it takes to keep us together. Whatever it takes." Lucy removed her thumb from her mouth and wrapped her small arms around Thomas's neck. "We help you," she whispered. "Yes," Sarah agreed with fierce determination. "We help you find someone who understands that we're already a family." As the official delegation rode away, leaving the three of them standing on the front porch, Thomas realized that the next week would determine not just whether they could stay together, but whether love and determination could triumph over bureaucracy and narrow-minded social expectations. The children had chosen to fight for their family. Now it was time for Thomas to prove he was worthy of that choice. That afternoon, as Sarah practiced piano and Lucy played with Patches the barn cat, Thomas sat at his kitchen table writing the most important letter of his life. He was writing to someone he'd never met, asking her to consider joining a family she'd never seen, based on nothing more than hope and the recommendations of mutual friends. But as he listened to the sound of children's laughter echoing through his house for the first time in 3 years, Thomas knew he was fighting for something worth any risk. He was fighting for home. The letter came back faster than Thomas had dared hope. 3 days after sending his desperate plea to Miss Catherine Sullivan, the schoolteacher Martha Henderson had recommended. A response arrived that would change everything. Thomas held the cream-colored envelope with trembling hands as Sarah and Lucy watched from the kitchen table where they'd been helping prepare lunch. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of Mrs. Whitmore's inspections, tense conversations, and the growing weight of time running out. "Is that from the lady?" Sarah asked quietly. "I think so." Thomas carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter, written in neat, careful handwriting. "Dear Mr. Brennan, your letter reached me at a time when I had been praying for direction in my own life. I am a widow of 2 years, having lost my husband to a mining accident. We had no children, though we hoped for them. Your situation with Sarah and Lucy touches my heart deeply. I have spoken with Martha Henderson, who speaks highly of your character and your devotion to these children. I have also made inquiries about the challenges you face with the welfare board. I am willing to meet with you and the children to discuss whether we might find a solution that serves everyone's needs. Theirs for stability, yours for family, and mine for purpose. I will arrive in Cedar Falls tomorrow on the afternoon stage. Respectfully yours, Catherine Sullivan." Thomas read the letter twice before the words fully sank in. Sarah had been watching his face intently, and when she saw his expression change, she jumped up from her chair. "She's coming? She's really coming?" "Tomorrow afternoon," Thomas confirmed, his voice thick with emotion and relief. Lucy clapped her hands together, a gesture of pure joy that had become more frequent as she continued to heal. "Lady coming to help us?" "Maybe, sweetheart. We'll have to see if we all get along." But even as Thomas spoke cautiously, hope was blooming in his chest, like spring flowers after a hard winter. Catherine Sullivan's letter suggested a woman of faith and compassion, someone who understood loss and the importance of family. The next day passed with nervous preparation. Sarah insisted on baking bread, though her technique was still developing. Lucy picked wildflowers from the meadow behind the house, creating a cheerful bouquet for their visitor. Thomas found himself cleaning rooms that were already spotless and rehearsing conversations that might never happen. Mrs. Whitmore arrived for her daily inspection, just as the afternoon stage was due to arrive in town. Her expression was skeptical as she observed their preparations. "Mr. Brennan, I hope you understand that we cannot approve an arrangement based solely on convenience. This woman, if she exists, must demonstrate genuine commitment to proper child rearing and moral guidance." "She exists," Sarah said firmly from her position by the window where she'd been watching the road. "And her name is Miss Catherine Sullivan. And she's coming because she wants to help our family." Mrs. Whitmore raised an eyebrow at Sarah's tone. "Young lady, adults are speaking. Adults are deciding our future," Sarah corrected with 8-year-old logic. "That makes it our conversation, too." Before Mrs. Whitmore could respond, Lucy pointed excitedly toward the road. "Wagon coming." Thomas looked out to see Jim Carlyle's wagon approaching, carrying a passenger he'd collected from the stage stop in town. Even from a distance, he could see that their visitor was a woman of medium height wearing a practical blue dress and carrying a small traveling bag. As the wagon drew closer, Thomas got his first clear look at Catherine Sullivan. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair neatly arranged under a simple bonnet. Her face was pleasant rather than beautiful, with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm composure that suggested inner strength. Jim helped her down from the wagon and tipped his hat. "Miss Sullivan, welcome to the Double B Ranch." Catherine thanked Jim politely, then turned toward the house where Thomas and the children waited on the porch with Mrs. Whitmore observing from the side. "Mr. Brennan?" Catherine's voice was warm, but cautious as she approached. "Miss Sullivan, thank you for coming." Thomas stepped forward, acutely aware that the next few minutes might determine his family's entire future. Catherine's gaze moved to the children, and Thomas saw something change in her expression, a softening that spoke of genuine interest rather than duty. "You must be Sarah and Lucy," she said, crouching down to their eye level. "I've heard so much about you both." Sarah studied the newcomer with the serious intensity she brought to important matters. "Are you really going to marry Daddy Thomas just to help us?" Catherine's eyes widened slightly at the directness of the question. "Sarah, that's something we would all need to discuss together." "But you came all this way," Lucy observed, with 4-year-old logic. "That means you want to help." "I came because I believe children should be with people who love them," Catherine said simply. "And from what I've heard, Mr. Brennan loves you very much." Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward with official authority. "Miss Sullivan, I am Mrs. Whitmore, from the Territorial Welfare Board. If you're seriously considering this arrangement, you should understand the significant responsibilities involved." Catherine stood and faced Mrs. Whitmore with quiet dignity. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been teaching children for 12 years. I understand responsibility quite well. Teaching and raising children are very different." "Yes, they are," Catherine agreed. "Teaching is about preparing children for the world. Raising them is about giving them the love and security they need to become good people. Both are important." Thomas watched this exchange with growing admiration for Catherine's composure under pressure. She wasn't intimidated by Mrs. Whitmore's authority, but she also wasn't combative. She simply stated her position with quiet confidence. "Miss Sullivan," Thomas said, "would you like to see the house? Meet the rest of our ... situation?" Catherine nodded, and Thomas gave her a tour while the children followed closely, and Mrs. Whitmore observed everything with sharp eyes. Catherine asked thoughtful questions about daily routines, the children's education, and their emotional needs. Her responses showed both practical understanding and genuine warmth. In the parlor, Sarah demonstrated her piano progress, playing a simple melody with careful concentration. Catherine listened with attention that wasn't feigned or polite. She genuinely enjoyed the music and praised Sarah's improvement. "Do you play?" Sarah asked hopefully. "I do. Perhaps we could play together sometime." Lucy, who had been unusually quiet during the tour, suddenly approached Catherine with her wooden horse carving. She held it out as a gift, a gesture that made Thomas's throat tight with emotion. "For me?" Catherine asked, accepting the small toy with appropriate solemnity. "Thank you, Lucy. I'll treasure it." After the tour, while the children played outside under Jim's watchful eye, the adults gathered in the kitchen for the serious conversation that would determine everything. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Whitmore began formally, "this arrangement would require immediate marriage and assumption of full parental responsibilities for 2 traumatized children. Are you prepared for such a commitment?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded carefully in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was steady and sure. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've spent 2 years wondering what God wanted me to do with my life after my husband died. I've been teaching other people's children while longing for a family of my own. When I received Mr. Brennan's letter, describing children who needed love and a man who was willing to risk everything to keep them safe, it felt like an answer to prayers I hadn't known how to pray. She turned to Thomas. Mr. Brennan, I won't pretend this isn't unusual. I won't pretend I'm not scared. But I've seen enough of life to know that love comes in unexpected ways, and family isn't always created in traditional circumstances. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Miss Sullivan, I need you to understand, I'm not asking you to marry me for romantic love. I'm asking you to help me save these children's future. That's not fair to you. Catherine smiled, the first truly warm smile he'd seen from her. Mr. Brennan, I'm 29 years old, a widow in a territory where unmarried women have few options. You're offering me the chance to be part of a family that desperately needs what I have to give, and to give meaning to losses that have felt meaningless for too long. How is that not fair? Mrs. Whitmore looked between them with obvious frustration. This is highly irregular, but not illegal, Catherine pointed out, and not harmful to the children. In fact, it provides exactly what you've said they need, a stable two-parent home with both masculine and feminine guidance. Through the window, they could see Sarah teaching Lucy to braid grass stems, while Jim carved a small whistle nearby. The scene was peaceful and domestic, a glimpse of the family life that hung in the balance. There's something else, Catherine said quietly. Something I need you all to know before any decisions are made. Thomas felt his newfound hope wavering. What is it? I've been in correspondence with the Mitchell family in Bozeman about Marcus. The room went dead silent. Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward with sharp interest while Thomas felt his heart stop. You contacted them? He asked. Martha Henderson helped me write to them, explaining the situation with his siblings. I hoped they might be willing to reconsider if they understood the full circumstances. And Catherine reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a letter. They've agreed to let Marcus return to his family. They said they'd grown fond of him, but they could see he was grieving for his siblings. They thought it was homesickness, but when they learned about the forced separation, Thomas couldn't speak. Sarah and Lucy's brother, the protective older boy who had tried so hard to keep his family together, was coming home. What about Emma? Thomas managed to ask. I'm still working on that. The Great Falls family is ... more resistant, but I have hopes. Mrs. Whitmore stood abruptly, clearly realizing that her carefully constructed objections were crumbling. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the fundamental concerns about proper supervision and Mrs. Whitmore. Catherine interrupted. Gently, with respect, I think your concerns have been addressed. Mr. Brennan will have a wife to provide feminine guidance. The children will have a mother figure who understands their needs. The family will be complete with Marcus returning, and hopefully Emma as well. It's still highly irregular. So was the original separation of these children, Thomas said firmly. So I was forcing them apart when they begged to stay together. Sometimes being irregular is exactly what's needed to fix things that were broken by too much regularity. Mrs. Whitmore looked around the room, clearly searching for objections that would stand up to scrutiny. Finding none, she gathered her papers with obvious frustration. Very well. If you proceed with this ... arrangement, the Welfare Board will consider the matter resolved. But I want it clearly understood that any future problems will result in immediate intervention. Understood, Thomas and Catherine said simultaneously. After Mrs. Whitmore departed in her official carriage, Thomas and Catherine sat on the front porch watching Sarah and Lucy play in the yard. The evening air was cool and peaceful, filled with the sounds of cattle settling for the night and the distant call of meadowlarks. Miss Sullivan, Thomas said quietly, I want you to know that this doesn't have to be a marriage in name only. But I also don't want you to feel pressured into anything beyond what you're comfortable with. Catherine was quiet for a moment, watching Lucy chase fireflies while Sarah helped her catch them in a mason jar. "Mr. Brennan," she said finally, "I've learned that the heart doesn't always follow conventional timelines. I can't promise to love you the way I loved my first husband, not yet. But I can promise to be a good wife and a loving mother to these children. The rest ... we'll see what time brings." 3 weeks later, on a sunny Saturday morning, Thomas Brennan and Catherine Sullivan were married in the small church in Cedar Falls. Sarah served as maid of honor, wearing a new dress Catherine had sewn. For her, Lucy was the flower girl, scattering petals with solemn concentration. Daniel and David stood beside Thomas as groomsmen, having returned from the Henderson farm for the wedding, and in the front pew, watching with a grin that stretched from ear to ear, sat Marcus Hartwell. He had arrived 2 days earlier, tall for his 16 years, but still young enough to cry when he hugged his siblings for the first time in a month. The only shadow on the perfect day was Emma's absence. The Great Falls family had refused to return her, insisting she was better off with them. But even that sorrow was tempered by hope. Catherine had legal connections in Great Falls, and she wasn't giving up. After the wedding, the expanded Brennan family returned to the ranch for a celebration that lasted well into the evening. Neighbors came with food and well wishes. Jim Carlisle played fiddle on the front porch, and children who had once faced an uncertain future danced under the Montana stars. Late that night, after the guests had gone home and the children were asleep in their beds, Thomas and Catherine sat on the front porch swing he'd hung that afternoon. "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked quietly, agreeing to all this. Catherine was quiet for a moment, listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch, settling into night. From upstairs came the faint sound of Sarah humming a lullaby to Lucy, and the occasional creak of floorboards as Marcus checked on his younger siblings, a habit he'd maintained even during his forced separation. "Ask me again in 20 years," Catherine said finally, "when we've raised these children and seen them become the people they're meant to be. When we've built a life together from this strange beginning. Ask me then if I regret choosing love over convention." Thomas reached for her hand, calloused from ranch work but warm and steady. "I will." 2 years later, Emma finally came home. Catherine's legal persistence had paid off when the Great Falls family faced financial difficulties and could no longer afford to keep her. By then, Emma was 15 and had missed crucial years with her siblings, but love and patience slowly healed those wounds. 5 years after that, Marcus married Henderson's oldest daughter, building a house on land Thomas deeded to him just over the ridge. Daniel became a doctor, inspired by Catherine's stories of healing and service. David opened a general store in Cedar Falls, using business skills he'd learned helping Thomas manage the ranch accounts. Sarah grew up to be a music teacher, traveling throughout the territory to bring piano lessons to children in remote areas. Lucy became a veterinarian, one of the first women in Montana Territory to pursue that profession, supported every step of the way by parents who believed children should follow their dreams regardless of gender. And Emma? Emma became a lawyer, determined to protect other children from the kind of institutional cruelty that had once threatened to destroy her family. The Double B Ranch prospered under the care of a family that understood the value of hard work and the importance of sticking together. The house that had once been silent with grief rang with the laughter of grandchildren, and Margaret's piano played daily as new generations learned to make music together. Thomas and Catherine's marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement, grew into a deep and lasting love built on shared purpose and mutual respect. They never forgot that their family had been forged in crisis and maintained through determination. On Thomas's 70th birthday, as he sat on the same front porch surrounded by children and grandchildren, someone asked him about the secret to building such a strong family from such difficult beginnings. "We chose each other," he said simply, looking around at faces that carried the features of the 6 frightened orphans he'd first met at the Cedar Falls orphanage. When the world tried to tell us we couldn't be a family, we chose each other. Anyway, and we kept choosing each other every day, through everything that came after. Sarah, now a grown woman with children of her own, added, "We learned that family isn't about blood or law or what other people think is proper. It's about the promise to never give up on each other." Lucy, the little girl who had once been too traumatized to speak, now spoke for a living as she advocated for animal welfare throughout the territory. We learned that love is stronger than fear, and that home is wherever your family chooses to be. As the sun set behind the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the Brennan family gathered around the old piano for their traditional evening music. Voices blended in harmony, spanning 3 generations, singing songs of gratitude and hope. The ranch that had once been too quiet now held the beautiful noise of a family that had refused to be broken. And in the fading light, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of 6 young voices from long ago, promising each other they would stay together no matter what. They had kept that promise, and in keeping it, they had discovered that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose to build from scratch, one act of love at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.